Good morning. Today is April 28th, 2026, and we are going to dive into 1984 again. We're going to start with Chapter 4. We're a little pressed on time today because I have something during my plan period, so we're just going to do Chapter 4. We left off with Chapter 2 and 3. And Chapter 3, we had memories of his childhood, that his mom died for him to live. He remembers the truth about the creators of the airplane, and that and who Eurasia's true enemy is. And we also found that there was proof of the telescreen monitoring and watching the people, because the instructor got onto Winston for not bending down far enough, I believe. All right, let's get into Chapter 4. With the deep, unconscious sigh, which not even the nearest of the telescreen could prevent him from uttering when his day's work started, Winston pulled the speak right toward him, blew the dust from its mouthpiece, and put on his spectacles. When he unrolled and clipped together 4 small cylinders of paper, which had already flopped out of the pneumatic tube on the right-hand side of his desk. The walls of the cubicle were 3 orifices. To the right of the right speak, a small pneumatic tube for writing messages to the left, a larger one for the newspapers, and in the side wall, within easy reach of Winston's arm, a large oblong slit protected by a wire grating. The last for the disposal of waste paper. Similar slits existed in thousands or tens of thousands throughout the building, not only in every room, but at short intervals in every corridor. For some reason, they were nicknamed memory holes. When one knew that any document was due for destruction, or even when one saw a scrap of waste paper lying about, it was an automatic reaction to lift the flap of the nearest memory hole and drop it in, whereupon it would be whirled away on a current of warm air to the enormous furnaces which were hidden somewhere in the recesses of the building. Winston examined the 4 slits of paper which he had unrolled. Each contained a message of only 1 or 2 lines in abbreviated jargon, not actual newspeak, but consisting largely of newspeak words, which was used in the ministry for internal purposes. They ran, Time, 17/3/84. BB speech malreported Africa rectify. Times, 19/12/83. Forecast 3 Yip 4th quarter. 83 misprints verify current issue. Times, 14/2/84. Mini plenty malquoted chocolate rectify. Times, 3/12/83. Reporting BB day order double plus ungood refs unpersons rewrite full wise up sub antifiling. So let's talk about this. This, I'm going to ask, is it shorthand? BB stands for Big Brother, presumably. YP, I do not know what that means. There's misprints, malreport, malquoted. This one I'm wondering because it says this is the longest one. Reporting Big Brother day order, double plus ungood. Really bad? Refs, unpersons, rewrite full wise, up sub, anti-filling. So this one is the most confusing. Let's see if Winston will give us a little bit of insight on what all of this means. With a faint feeling of satisfaction, Winston laid the 4th message aside. It was an intricate and responsible job and had better be dealt with last. The other 3 were routine manners, though the second one would probably mean some tedious wading through lists of figures. Winston dialed back numbers on the telescreen and called for the appropriate issues of The Times, which slid out of the pneumatic tube after only a few minutes' delay. The messages he had received referred to articles on news items, which for one reason or another it was thought unnecessary to alter, or, as the official phrase had it, to rectify. For example, it appeared from the Times of the 7th of March that Big Brother, in his speech of the previous day, had predicted that the South Indian Front would remain quiet, but that a Eurasian offensive would shortly be launched in North Africa. As it happened, the Eurasian Higher Command had launched its offensive in South India and left North Africa alone. Therefore, necessary to rewrite a paragraph of Big Brother's speech in a way as to make him predict the thing that actually happened. Or again, the Times of the 19th of December had published the official forecast of the output of various classes of consumption goods in the fourth quarter of 1983, which was also the sixth quarter of the ninth three-year plan. Today's issue contained a statement of the actual output, from which it appeared that the forecasts were in every instance grossly wrong. Winston's job was to rectify the original figures by making them agree with the later ones. As for the third message, it referred to a simple error which could be set right in a couple of minutes. A short time ago, as of February, the Ministry of Plenty had issued a promise, a categorical pledge, were the official words, that there would be no reduction of the chocolate ration until during 1984. So I want to highlight this really quickly. Where does it say? So Winston works at the Ministry of Truth. Which means the truth correlates into rewriting / altering facts. Ergo, not truth. Actually, as Winston was aware, the chocolate ration was to be reduced from 30 grams to 20 at the end of the present week. All of that was needed to substitute for the original promise, a warning that it would probably be necessary to reduce the ration at some time in April. As soon as Winston had dealt with each of these messages, he clipped his speak-written corrections to the appropriate copy of the Times and pushed them into the pneumatic tube. Then, with a moment which was as nearly as possible unconscious, he crumpled up the original message and any notes that he himself had made and dropped them into the memory hole to be devoured by the flames. What happened in the unseen labyrinth to which the pneumatic tube led, he did not know in detail, but he did know in general terms. As soon as the corrections, which happened to be necessary in any particular number of the Times, had been assembled and collated, the number would be reprinted, the original copy destroyed, and the corrected copy placed in the files in its stead. This process of continuous alteration was applied not only to newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs, to every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance. Let's highlight that. There we go. We're highlighting this because the party being wrong is unimaginable. So they created the Ministry of Truth so that the government or the party cannot be faulted for any bad thing whatsoever. And if something were to come up that is bad, they want to blame it on Goldstein, not Big Brother, not the party. Day by day and almost minute by minute, the past was brought up to date. In this way, every prediction made by the party could be shown by documentary evidence to have been correct. nor was any items of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the part of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. All history was palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often as was necessary. In no case would it have been possible, once the deed was done, to prove that any falsification had taken place. The largest section of the Department of Records, far larger than the one on which Winston worked, consisted simply of persons whose duty it was to track down and collect all copies of books, newspapers, and other documents which had been superseded and were due for destruction. A number of the times which might, because of the changes in political alignment or mistaken prophecies uttered by Big Brother, have been rewritten a dozen times, still stood on the files bearing its original date, and no other copy existed to contradict it. Books, also, were recalled and rewritten again and again, and invariably reissued without any admission that any alteration had been made. Even the written instructions which Winston received, and which he invariably got rid of as soon as he had dealt with them, never stated or implied that any act of forgery was to be committed. Always the reference was to slips, errors, misprints, or misquotations, which was necessary to put right in the interest of accuracy. But actually, he thought as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's figures, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense to the other. Most of the material that you were dealing with had no connection. Just going to circle that because that is not how we spell connection, but since they're dumbing down the population, that's how they spell it. Most of the material you were dealing with had no connection with anything in the real world, not even the kind of connection that is contained in a direct lie. Statistics were just as much a fantasy in their original version as in their rectified version. A great deal of the time, you were expected to make them up for your own head. For example, the Ministry of Plenty's forecast had estimated the output of boots for the quarter at 145 million pairs. The actual output was given as 62 millions. Winston, however, in rewriting the forecast, marked the figure down to 57 millions, so as to allow for the usual claim that the quota had been overfulfilled. In any case, 62 millions was no nearer the truth than 57 millions, or than 45 millions. Most likely no boots had been produced at all. Likelier still, nobody knew how many had been produced, much less cared. All one knew was that every quarter astronomical numbers of boots were produced on paper, while perhaps half the population of Oceania were barefoot. So my question right now, let's highlight this. Why lie? Because to me, it doesn't seem like there is a rich class and a poor class. So why lie? What is the benefit? And why, if I were to double think, so to speak, then why I would be asking myself where those 145 million pairs or the 65 million pairs of boots went. And it was so with every class of recorded fact, great or small. Everything faded away into a shadow world in which, finally, even the date of the year had become uncertain. Winston glanced across the hall, and the corresponding cubicle on the other side of a small, precise-looking, dark-chinned man named Tillotson was working steadily away, with a folded newspaper on his knee and his mouth very close to the mouthpiece of the speakwrite. He had the air of trying to keep what he was saying a secret between himself and the telescreen. He looked up, and his spectacles darted a hostile flash in Winston's direction. Winston hardly knew Tillotson, and had no idea what work he was employed on. People in the Department of Records did not readily talk about their jobs. In the long, windowless hall, it was a double row of cubicles, and its endless rustle of papers and hum of voices murmuring into speakwrites. There were quite a dozen people whom Winston did not even know by name, although he daily saw them hurrying to and fro in the corridors or gesticulating gesticulating in the 2 minutes hate. He knew in the cubicle next to him, the little woman with sandy hair toiled day in and day out, simply at tracking down and deleting from the press the names of people who had been vaporized and were therefore considered never to have existed. There was a certain fitness in that, since her own husband had been vaporized a couple years earlier. A few cubicles away, a mild, ineffectual, dreamy creature named Ampleforth, with very hairy ears and of surprising talent for juggling with rhymes and meters, was engaged in producing garbled versions, definitive texts they were called, of poems which had become ideologically offensive, but which, for one reason or another, were to be retained in the anthologies. And this hall, with its 50 workers or thereabouts, was only one subsection, a single cell, as it were, in the huge complexity of the records department. Beyond, above, below, were swarms of workers engaged in unimaginable multitude of jobs. There were the huge printing shops with their sub-editors, their typography experts, and their laboratory-equipped studios for the faking of photographs. There were the teleprograms section with its engineers, its producers, and its team of actors specially chosen for their skill in imitating voices. There were the armies of reference clerks whose job was simply to draw up a list of books and periodicals which were due for recall. There were vast repositories where the correct documents were stored, and the hidden furnaces where the original copies were destroyed. And somewhere or another, quite anonymous, there was the directing brains who co-coordinated the whole effort and laid down the lines of policy which made it necessary that this fragment of the past should be preserved, that one falsified and the other one rubbed out of existence. And the Department of Record, after all, and the Records Department, after all, was itself only a single branch of the Ministry of Truth, whose primary job was not to reconstruct the past, but to supply the citizens of Oceania with newspapers, films, textbooks, telescreen programs, plays, novels, with every conceivable kind of information, instruction, or entertainment, from a statue to a slogan, from a lyric poem to a biological treatise, from a child's spelling book to a Newspeak dictionary. And the ministry had not only to supply the multifarious needs of the party, but also to repeat the whole operation at a lower level for the benefit of the proletariat. There was a whole chain of separate departments dealing with proletarian literature, music, drama, and entertainment generally. Here were produced rubbishly newspapers containing almost nothing except sport, crime, and astrology, sensational 5-cent novelettes, films oozing with sex, and sentimental songs which were composed entirely by mechanical means on a special kind of kaleidoscope known as a versificator. There was even a whole subsection, pornosec. It was called a Newspeak, engaged in producing the lowest kind of pornography, which was sent out in sealed packets in which no party member, other than those who worked on it, were permitted to look at. 3 messages had slid out of the pneumatic tube while Winston was working, but they were simple matters. He had disposed of them before the 2-minute hate interrupted him. When the hate was over, he returned to his cubicle, took the Newspeak dictionary from the shelf, pushed the speakwrite to one side, cleaned his spectacles, and settled down to his main job of the morning. Winston's greatest pleasure in life was in his work. Most of it was a tedious routine, but it included in there were also jobs so difficult and intricate that you could lose yourself in them, as in the depths of a mathematical problem. Delicate pieces of forgery in which you had nothing to guide you except your knowledge of principles and ink-sunk for your estimate of what the party wanted you to say. Winston was good at this kind of thing. On occasion, he had even been entrusted with the rectification of The Times' leading article, which were written entirely in Newspeak. He unrolled the messages that he had set aside earlier. It ran, Times, 3/12/83, reporting BB de order, double plus ungood, refs on persons, rewrite full wise, up sub, anti-filing. In Old Speak, or Standard English, it might be rendered, the reporting of Big Brother's order for the day in the Times of December 3rd, 1983 is extremely unsatisfactory and makes reference to non-existent persons. Rewrite it in full and submit your draft to the higher authority before filing. Okay, so we finally have an understanding of the fourth message that he had received. And it's basically saying get rid of names who were vaporized. Winston read through the offending article. Big Brother's orders for the day, it seemed, had been chiefly devoted to praising the work of an organization known as FFCC, which supplied cigarettes and other comforts to the sailors in the floating fortress. A certain Comrade Withers, a prominent member of the inner party, had been singled out for special mention and awarded a decoration, the Order of Conspicuous Merit, second class. 3 months later, FFCC suddenly had been dissolved with no reasons given. One could assume that Withers and his associates were now in disgrace, but there had been no report of the matter in the press or on the telescreen. That was to be expected, since it was unusual for political offenders to be put on trial or even publicly denounced. The great purges involving thousands of people with public trials of traitors and thought criminals who made abject confessions of their crimes and were afterwards executed were special showpieces, not occurring oftener than once in a couple years. More commonly, people who had incurred the displeasure of the party simply disappeared and were never heard of again. One never had the smallest clue as to what happened to them. In some cases, they might not even be dead. Perhaps 30 people personally known to Winston, not counting his parents, had disappeared at one time or another. Winston stroked his nose gently with a paper clip. In the cubicle across the way, Comrade Tittleson was still crouching secretively over his right speak. He raised his head for a moment. Again, the hostile spectacle flashed. Winston wondered whether Comrade Tittleson was engaged on the same job as himself. It was perfectly possible. So a tricky piece of work would never be entrusted to a single person. On the other hand, to turn it over to a committee would be to admit openly that the act of fabrication was taking place. Likely as many as a dozen people were now working away on rival versions of what Big Brother actually said. And presently, some master brain in the inner party would select the version of that, would re-edit it and set in motion the complex process of cross-referencing that would be required. And then the chosen lie would pass into permanent records and become truth. Winston did not know why Withers hadn't been disgraced. Perhaps it was for corruption or incompetence. Perhaps Big Brother was merely getting rid of a too popular subordinate. Perhaps Withers or someone else close to him had been suspected of heretical tendencies. Or perhaps, what is likeliest of all, the thing that simply happened because purges and vaporizations were a necessary part of the mechanics of government. The only real clue lay in the words refs on persons, which indicated that Withers was already dead. You could not invariably assume this would be the case when people were arrested. Sometimes they were released and allowed to remain at liberty for as much as a year or 2 years before being executed. Very occasionally, some person whom you had believed dead long since would make a ghostly reappearance at some public trial where he would implicate hundreds of others by his testimony before vanishing. This time forever. I want to highlight this, and I think the bell's about to go off, so we'll highlight this and then talk about it. I don't think that in the United States we have something as extreme as getting rid of somebody is the way that our government works. However, I do believe that in cases like this, there are some things that it feels almost suspicious, as Winston is talking about. That, we just had on Saturday, the White House Correspondents' Dinner unfortunately got shot up. I don't think that anyone got hurt or injured, but a lot of people suspected that this, along with the first Trump assassination attempt, had been a PR stunt and stage in order to get sympathy for the president. That this is a parallel that you could use. You could argue this, because I think I personally would not be shocked. However, I do not want you to formulate your opinion on what happened on Saturday because of what I say. Withers, however, was already an unperson. He did not exist. He never existed. Winston decided that it would not be enough simply to reverse the tendency of Big Brother's speech. It was better to make a deal with something totally unconnected with its original subject. He might turn the speech into the usual denunciation of traitors and thought criminals, but that was a little too obvious. While to invent a victory at the front or some triumph of overproduction in the ninth 3-year plan might implicate the records too much. What was needed was a piece of pure fantasy. Suddenly there sprang into his mind, already made as it were, the image of a certain Comrade Ogilvy, who had recently died in battle in heroic circumstances. There were occasions when Big Brother devoted his order for the day to commemorating some humble rank-and-file party member whose life and death he held up as an example worthy to be followed. Today he should commemorate Comrade Ogilvy. It was true that there was no such person as Comrade Ogilvy, but a few lines of print and a couple faked photographs would soon bring him into existence. Winston thought for a moment, then pulled the speak right toward him and began dictating Big Brother's familiar style, a style at once military and pedantic, and because of a trick asking questions and then promptly answering them. What lessons do we learn from this fact, comrades? The lesson, which also one of the fundamental principles of Ingsoc, that etc., easy to imitate. At the age of 3, Comrade Ogilvy had refused all toys except for a drum, a submachine gun, and a model helicopter. At 6, a year early, by a special relaxation of rules, he had joined the spies. At 9, he had been a troop leader. At 11, he had denounced his uncle to the thought police after overhearing a conversation which appeared to him to have criminal tendencies. At 16, he had been a district organizer of the Junior Anti-Sex League. At 19, he had designed a hand grenade which had been adopted by the Ministry of Peace and which, at its first trial, had killed 31 Eurasian prisoners in one burst. At 23, he had perished in action. Pursued by the enemy jet planes while flying over Indian Ocean with important dispatches, he had weighted his body with his submachine gun and leapt out of the helicopter into deep water, dispatches and all. An end, said Big Brother, which was impossible to contemplate without feelings or envy. Big Brother added a few remarks on the purity and single-mindedness of Comrade Ogilvy's life. He was a total abstainer and a non-smoker, had no recreations except a daily hour in the gymnasium, and had taken a vow of celibacy, believing marriage and the care of a family is to be incompatible with a 24-hour-a-day devotion to duty. He had no subjects of conversation except the principles of Ingsoc, and no aim in life except to defeat the Eurasian enemy and in the hunting down of spies, saboteurs, thought criminals, and traitors generally. Winston debated himself whether to award Comrade Ogilvy the Order of Conspicuous Merit. In the end, he decided against it because of the unnecessary cross-referencing that would entail. Once again, he glanced at his rival in the opposite cubicle, something to him with the certainty that Tittleson was busy on the same job himself. There was no way of knowing whose job would be adopted, but he felt a profound conviction that it would be his own. Comrade Ogilvy, unimagined an hour ago, was now a fact. It struck him as curious as you could create dead men but not living ones. Comrade Ogilvy, who never existed in the present, now existed in the past, and once an act of forgery was forgotten, he would just exist as authentically and upon the same evidence as Charlemagne or Julius Caesar. All right, so chapter 4, we get a lot of insight about the ministry of truth. They constantly alter facts. Party never wrong. Oh, I spelled wrong incorrectly. I'm gonna slide this down. Theory is that everyone is working on the same thing. On same alteration. And this would be so that higher ups can decide whose is better. And also, possibly, this is my theory, higher ups can also see who is loyal to the party. That's really the big takeaway with this chapter, is that we're just kind of getting more of an insight into Winston's job and what he does and what the ministry of truth actually is. Which it's a short chapter, but for reference, like this is still world building. That if we were to still use this, which is the graph for narrative stories, this is the intro / world building, and we're still here. So chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 are still here. We really have to lay the groundwork before we get into the action. What's the situation? What's going on? And we could argue that Winston's character in itself, he is at a point where there is a little bit of rising action for his character, for his development. You know, he's beginning to question the party. That is a rising action. But it's not a rising action yet because he's not doing anything to question it. He's not doing anything publicly. The most that he's doing is keeping a journal where he has said, it's not 100% wrong, except for when he was saying down with Big Brother, but nobody knows about it yet. So we don't have a conflict or the rise of a conflict. We just have internal conflict, which unfortunately is not enough right now for that rising action because we don't know what he's going to do with these thoughts. Anyways, that's it for today. Like I said, it's a short one because I have something during my plan period, but I will do chapters 5 and 6 tomorrow, I believe. So that is all today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Bye.